Today we're talking about the thrilling topic of restrictions. HOA restrictions, city ordinances, county ordinances, deed restrictions. What do they look like in East Tennessee? Let's dive in and get going. Hey, what's up? It's me, Haley Jones, your local East Tennessee real estate agent. I help clients buy and sell land, homes, etc. I'm from the Knoxville area, former high school math teacher. Also have done some international development work in Ethiopia and Liberia. But I went to school in Carson Newman, Jefferson City. My family's from Morristown. I live in Seymour. I grew up in West Knox. My husband's from South Knox. I know a thing or two about the area. So anyways, that's kind of the background for me. I've been doing real estate now for over 5 years and helped over 200 families buy and sell properties. So that being said, let's talk about restrictions. So let me say this. I have lived in 3 places, well, 4, but for an extended period of time, I've lived in 3 places: Knoxville, Memphis, and Atlanta, Georgia. Knoxville, Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia. So just bear in mind that I am anchored in Tennessee life. I did spend a summer in East St. Louis, and I spent a summer in Brooklyn, but I don't really count those as like I know much in terms of like what's going on with properties there. My experience is Memphis, Knoxville, and Georgia. So just bear that in mind. I want to say that because I'm finding that we have a lot of people relocating here. 50,000 people have relocated to the East Tennessee area since 2020 and continue to come here to the East Tennessee area. And a lot of times people say they're coming here because they want less regulation. They are fed up with certain things happening in their kids' school systems. They are fed up with different politics, etc. So I want to tell you that you're coming to East Tennessee for those reasons. And so when you think about like restrictions and HOAs and all this, they are most likely less restrictive than wherever you're thinking about moving from. So just kind of keep that in mind. Sometimes when I say restrictions, people are like, oh my God. But the thing is, I get the impression from my clients that our version of restrictions here is not really restrictions. And I could get into like different building codes and permitting and all this, and like you would be like, oh wow, this is way different. So I just want to give you that caveat that probably, even when I say restrictions, probably they're not as restrictive as wherever it is that you're thinking of coming from. Now, I don't know your exact restrictions, but I just want you to kind of bear that in mind. If you are somebody who wants a super restrictive, everything is restricted, then maybe the Knoxville and East Tennessee area is not for you. So that's a little caveat there. Now, let's talk about, when I say restrictions, what exactly am I talking about? We're talking about city ordinances. We're talking about county ordinances, HOA, covenants, codes, and restrictions. So your CC&Rs, your homeowners association rules, or POA, property owners association rules, and or deed restrictions. So for the most part, there's not really such a thing as unrestricted because every property anywhere is within a county. So there's always going to be, at the lowest level, your county restrictions. Your county restrictions are going to be your least restricting of anything, and that varies county to county. So Knox County is bordered by a number of counties, and all of those counties, Anderson, Jefferson, Loudoun, Blount, Sevier, all of them have their own ideas about restrictions, county and city, if there are certain cities within those counties. Your most restrictive are going to be your city ordinances, your city restrictions. And these are specific to the city. So for example, if you are in Knoxville and you're looking at a property within the city limits of Knoxville, you're gonna have the city ordinances as well as the county ordinances. The Knoxville city government regulates, mandates, enforces the city ordinances, and then your county governments enforce, etc., your county ordinances. Now, also as a side note, Farragut is its own township and it also has its own ordinances. So kind of keep that in mind if you're thinking Farragut. Now that's the town of Farragut. So technically 37934, even though 37922 is also zone Farragut, but is not within the town of Farragut. So That's just a little thing there. If you're like, Haley, what the hell are you talking about? If you're not looking at Farragut, don't even worry about it, okay? But I just want to make you aware of that. Now, when I say a city ordinance, like I said, these are local laws specific to that city. And these deal with, city ordinances come into play a lot of times with my clients when we're looking at zoning. So if you want to have short-term rentals, you want to look at the zoning. What is it zoned? If you're wanting to put more than one property or home site on a piece of property, what are the zoning rules for that? Can you have a business out of your home? Again, that's a zoning issue. Zoning is also going to tell you, essentially, when you think zoning, you're thinking agricultural, residential, and commercial. But if you were to go look at just as an example, when you look at the city of Knoxville ordinances on zoning, just the residential zones and districts, you've got EN, an RN1, an RN2, an RN3, it keeps going. So you've got a number of different even types of residential zones. And those residential zones tell you like, okay, yes, you can have a house here, you cannot have a church. Or maybe some of the residential stuff is like you could have a house in the church, or you could have a barber shop, or maybe you can't. So zoning tells you kind of what you can do with the property, and that's also going to give you rules about, and this is related to your building codes as well, but in your building rules, your setbacks and restrictions on, like if you were to look at the South Knox, like the waterfront district, if you just look at a strip of land, if you go look at the KGIS, the Knoxville Geographical Information Systems map, and you look at zoning under South Knoxville, just on the river, South Knox Waterfront District, there's like, I can't even tell you. I mean, like literally 4, 5, 6 different color codes of different things based on where that property is. And they're all like right next to each other. So you want to check your zoning to make sure you can do what you want to do. Now, if you're just buying a house in a neighborhood, you probably don't care about the zoning. But if you're like, I want 5 acres and I want to put 5 homes on those acres, you're going to need to check the zoning, and you're also going to need to check what the rules are with building permits, what you can do, what's the soil permitting, is it soil map? So you've got a bunch of stuff to consider if you're looking at like, you want to do something with this land, what do you want to do with that land? City ordinances also mandate things like in the city of Knoxville, you can't have chickens, for example. So I think it specifically says keeping swine or poultry. It shall be unlawful for any person to keep, harbor, or combine any animal of swine species or any type of poultry in any building, structure, shed, corral, pen, or enclosure within the corporate limits of the city, except where such animals are being kept in a licensed stock show, where such animals are kept in a licensed slaughterhouse, where swine are being kept at least blah, 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 where a permit is issued for Vietnamese pot-bellied pigs, where such animals are kept at licensed research facilities, where a limited number of domesticated female chicken hens are kept pursuant to a permit as set forth below in this chapter. So, okay, it's saying you can have chickens, but you have to have a permit. Now, if you were to go look at the county of Knoxville, I didn't see a single place where chicken are even mentioned because you're allowed to have them out in the county. So that's just an example of like, there's some differences. In the city, there's also some rules about dogs. You've got leash laws and all kinds of different things. You've got laws about you can't just have a dog tied up outside. So city rules are different than county rules. So that's the first level of restriction I want to shout out to you is city ordinances. The next thing I want to shout out to you is let's move to this idea of HOA and deed restrictions. So technically an HOA bylaw, you're going to find that in the deed. You could call that a deed restriction. When I think of deed restrictions, I think of them different than HOA. HOA is straightforward as in it does exist and there are the rules. So HOA, Homeowners Association, these are rules and expectations for living in a community governed by a homeowners association. This is from the National Association of Realtors website. They have a nice graphic about this, but essentially an HOA covenant may prevent residents for example, from painting their home certain colors, or may require all residents to pay a certain fee. A lot of our HOA rules here, what you're most commonly going to see are that there is some sort of architectural review board. So if you wanted to add on to the house, if you wanted to put a detached garage, a lot of times you're going to see a rule that says either it has to be a certain size or it has to be in the same material as the house is. If you're going to add anything, you're going to have those plans approved by the HOA board. So that's what we most often see. You also see sometimes rules about parking and what kinds of vehicles can be parked. Anything on the street, can you park an RV? We see a lot of stuff about fencing, for example. A lot of times you'll see where you cannot have fencing off the front, so it has to be off the side of the house or in the back. We see rules about sheds. Sheds need to be behind the house, for example, or not at all, or certain types of sheds. We also see, of course, rules about dogs, especially if it's a townhouse or condo community. There's rules about what types of dogs, how big a dog, how many dogs, or animals in general. You see some more obscure things, and sometimes there are restrictions, but there's no HOA, which is more technically a deed restriction, but there's no really enforcing body. So that's where sometimes you're taking a chance that like these don't really exist anymore, but if they flow with the house, if they're on the deed, then technically they do follow. And sometimes we see restrictions that are 50 years old. The developer is gone. A lot of times an HOA rule comes from the initial developer for what they anticipate that community or those type of homeowners are going to want. Also sometimes you'll see like restrictions are in place, but then you see the restrictions and they are literally stupid. Like I've seen before, no outside toilets, which is weird. Or I've seen one before that's like your children can't be running in the streets unattended. This is a true story. I'll see if I can find it. That is a true story. Literally have seen that on it, which why would the children be running in the street anyways? You know what I mean? So there's some things it's like really, also you'll see sometimes like no clotheslines or no landfills on the property. Also, you'll see things about how large of a house can be. If it's a single story house, it needs to be X amount of square footage. If it's a 2-story house, it needs to be whatever square footage and whatever height, blah, blah, blah. Building materials you can or cannot use. So those are all different things that you're going to see within an HOA. And sometimes it's also about like what you can do with landscaping. Again, I talked about parking in your different maintenance rules. There are some communities or neighborhoods where there are some people monitoring where your garbage cans. So if you want that type of regulation, then it does exist. If you do not want that type of regulation, then make sure you read the restrictions with the property you're considering buying. So anyways, those are some different thoughts about HOA covenants and conditions and restrictions. Now you've got the bylaws, which kind of say how they operate. The rules tell you like what the rules are. So those are kind of your different parts of your HOA restrictions and what exactly you can and cannot do. How would you know like if there is a HOA restriction? Well, first of all, we have here, it'll say like the listing will say if there's an HOA. And then the biggest thing to me that's going to indicate how involved your HOA is, and this is just an assumption that I make, so I just want to say that this is not always true. But if there is a crazy high HOA fee, there is probably a more involved HOA. Then sometimes you'll see a voluntary HOA. So this would be, say for example, the neighborhood has a pool and you can opt into being a part of this HOA. It's voluntary. Some very popular and more like iconic old school neighborhoods in Knoxville that have an HOA or a POA is like West Hills, Dean Hill. Both of those are voluntary. So anyways, you don't have to opt in and pay for them, but those are super iconic neighborhoods in Knoxville, like if you old school, you know what I mean? So that's a voluntary situation, in which case there's not really restrictions. It's something you could opt into. It's more about like being a part of the community more so than anything else. Okay, now let's talk about a deed restriction. A deed restriction follows with a deed, which could technically be an HOA restriction, but a deed restriction goes with the property. And oftentimes when you see a deed restriction, this is something like, the most common one I see is when people are looking at land and the land's just sitting there. People are like, why this land's just sitting there if it's a cheap piece of land, for example. Well, sometimes there are rules against mobile and manufactured homes. When that's the case, a lot of people want, cheaper land, or that is an option. I'm making a general statement here, so don't take offense to what I'm saying, but all I'm saying is the most often deed restriction that I've seen is things like you cannot put a mobile or manufactured home on the property. You also see things about like animals or certain things you can or cannot build. I have a piece of land right now and it's got like these setback rules. Piece of land listed, it's got setback rules because they're not wanting the developer put that deed restriction there because they're not wanting properties right on the road. They want to have the setback. It could be anything. And of course, if you go to the internet, it mentions structural restrictions, so size, material, and style. Use restriction, so what can you even do on the property? A deed restriction may also limit you to the number of buildings or homes you might have on that property. Aesthetic restrictions such as landscaping, fencing, and exterior colors, animal restrictions. So it could be similar to what you see on an HOA. Now, What's going to be the hardest to find? A deed restriction. A deed restriction could also be something like, this isn't really a restriction, but it could impact your use of the land, an easement or a right-of-way. So there might be a utility easement going through the middle of the property. Well, if you're looking at 2 acres and there is a electrical power line easement through the middle of those 2 acres, it might not be what you want. And how would you know that? Well, sometimes that's not mentioned in the listing. If you're a Google Maps sleuth person, you can sometimes see that power line easement going through. But the way to be sure is to pull the deed, and the deed is going to say easement or right of way. And then usually it's going to say, as mentioned in book 500, page blah, blah, blah. So you're going to go look at that and see, what does that say? Recently, I had some clients interested in a house with acreage, and I was checking for restrictions, and the deed went from purchase was like 1980, something like that. At the time, there was an oil and gas lease in place, and so that impacted that property, right? And so we only would have known that just from looking at the deed. So a deed restriction, your best place to find it is on the actual deed itself. Your title company can also tell you. I like to see it myself. Personally, I just want to see. But those sometimes can be a little bit hidden, whereas an HOA is pretty much like outright. There's an HOA or there's not an HOA. A city ordinance is pretty much outright, like the zoning, what the rules are in the city. A county ordinance is the same. The deed restrictions are the one that are going to be a little bit harder to find. Now, if something says on a listing unrestricted, technically it still has the county ordinances to follow, but it's pretty much, you can do what you want. And if you're like, well, I want to know the facts of I can do what I want, then you want to check the zoning for the county. And then if you have questions about what you can do on the land, your best bet is then going to be the county office to ask if there's like some gray area around what you want to do. So anyways, in my mind, overall, I don't feel that the majority of our HOAs here in this area, nor our city ordinances or our county ordinances, are overly restrictive. I think that something that people like here, people like to be able to do what they want. I will say that if you already know, like an HOA is not going to be your jam, for example, I would say that for my husband, he's not really an HOA guy. Like, he's not going to be listening to what anyone's telling him to do. He has a barrel fire in the backyard, a 50-gallon barrel. Okay, you can't do that in an HOA. You know, they probably don't even have that written on there. He'd be the reason why they would add it. You know what I'm saying? If that's not for you, then you don't move into those neighborhoods. If you want more restrictions, then by all means, you do that. If you want, you know, specifics on how people keep their yards and you want it to be nice and you don't want people parking in the street. As my very good friends say, street cars. Shout out to Candace, my friend, and street cars. But that being said, I mean, I don't think any of this is like overly crazy. I think the point is to know what you need to do with the property and do the restrictions that are there restrict you from doing it. And if that is the case, then it's not the right fit for you. The other thing I want to mention that's not really a restriction, but if we're talking about property, go check out some of my videos about septic systems and soil mapping, because you might find a beautiful piece of property, your dream property, but the soil may not support what you need to do on the septic side of things. So I just want to put that out there, because you're going to have to get a septic permit in order to put in a septic system. Septic systems have to be permitted. Now, some properties you will see there is no permit on file, and that's a whole other video for a whole other time. But that being said, I just want to like put that bug in your ear. If you're looking at land, you're going to be checking restrictions, and you also want to check what's happening with soil mapping, water sources, can you tie into public water, public sewer, gas lines, etc. So I think that covers everything on restrictions. I know restrictions are a really thrilling topic, and it's probably, you're not gonna be able to sleep tonight because you're so excited about this topic. But if you have questions on how to find restrictions, does a property have a restriction, what does this restriction mean, you can always shoot me an email or send me a text or call, and I'm happy to help you. In the meantime, I'm Haley Jones. Click subscribe, because I've got so much more to talk to you about in the Knoxville and East Tennessee area. And I'll see you next time.